Ashay, my loves. This your girl, Miss Queen, coming at you again. As promised, we got a lot. We got a long way to go in this series here. This is part two of Let's Talk About Sex, reciprocity. Sex. We're talking about sex and the impact that it has on relationships and marriages. You know that equal give and take thing. You know what's good for you is good for me. You know, no one-sided thing. Just like you love head, I love head too, my nigga. We all grown here. And also the connection of sex and spirituality. You know, sex is a beautiful thing. Making love anyway. You know, it takes you to a higher realm of consciousness. See, people abuse sex. Some people they use it in different forms. You know what I'm saying? Like, narcissists use it, to kind of control men and women. Both narcissists, men and women. See, I don't discriminate because we both, all of us, men and women, we both have masculine and feminine energies, my love. We embody both. The key is to balance them out. Find that equilibrium. Some men act like they so scared to get in touch with their feminine side. Sometimes I wonder, are they a little, what's that word I'm trying to think of? Self-conscious. That's it, self-conscious. Maybe deep down inside, they might be. You know what I'm saying? A little funny. And they try to put on something on the outside, but who are we to judge people? You can't help who you love. That's why I say about people who project their own insecurities on others. The way they feel about themselves is what they project on others. You know what I'm saying? Hurt people hurt people. That's it. The way you feel on the inside about yourself, your true feelings, that's what you throw out on other people. You project on other people. That's why I keep myself away from them energy vampires. Once you show your true colors to me, you don't have to worry about Deanna. That's my real name, Deanna. You don't have to worry about Deanna Marie, Empress Queen Goddess, or EQG, whatever one you want to call me. I do. I had picked up certain vibrations off of people. I don't have to be face to face with a person. I'm an empath, baby. I'm gifted. I pick up vibrations from 2,000 miles away. I'm psychic. Anyway, loves, this is part two because we have about this. This book is about 9 hours, right at 10 hours long. That's why I'm breaking it up to different parts. So we're gonna begin with part two of sex and God. How religion distorts sexuality.
Chapter 3, Screwing with Religious Myths. Common myths. Many myths are built into our sexual ideas. Most people never question or examine them. In fact, to question the myths is to question the religion. How does one question the virgin birth without questioning Catholicism?
Right.
How does one examine the pedophilia of Muhammad marrying a 9-year-old girl without questioning Islam? How does one talk about Joseph Smith's revelation in the 1840s that Mormon men can have as many wives as they like, and President Wolford's about-face revelation in 1890 that Mormons can only have one wife, without questioning the foundations of Mormonism? All of these are sexual myths. The very first story in the books of Genesis is a sexual myth. Quote, "Then the eyes of both of them were opened, and they realized they were naked. So they sewed fig leaves together and made coverings for themselves." Genesis 3:7. Exactly what Adam and Eve did is never stated, but it had something to do with sex.
That's right.
In the Quran, we learn the myth that women have an illness when menstruating. The cow 2:22. "They questioned thee, O Muhammad, concerning menstruation. Say, it is an illness, so let women alone at such times, and go not unto them till they are cleansed. And when they have purified themselves, then go unto them as Allah hath enjoined upon you. Truly Allah loveth those who turn unto him, and loveth those who have a care."
Yeah, the Muslims, when their wife is on her administration, they don't sleep in the same bed together. Unclean, that's what they say.
Cleanliness. In Romans 5:12, Paul is very clear that original sin came from Adam and has corrupted mankind ever since. "Wherefore, as by one man sin entered into the world, and death by sin, so death passed upon all men, for that all have sinned." From this unfathomable idea come centuries of torture and deprivation for millions of humans. You were born imperfect, and your very sexuality is living proof of that imperfection. It can and will damn you forever, especially if you are a woman. Woman tempted man and caused the fall. Therefore, she is the more sinful and suspect of the sexes. Other myths are more specific to our sexual behavior. Masturbation is against God's commandment not to spill your seeds. It was called onanism for centuries, after the poor fellow Onan in the book of Genesis, who chose to spill his seed rather than father a child by his deceased brother's wife. A quaint practice of the day that modern religionists forget to include in their list of sins, failing to father children by your dead brother's wife. Modern religionists look at the spilling of seed as the crime, not screwing his brother's wife, probably against her will. The list of myths we can acquire about sex and sexuality is amazingly long. Here is a short sample. God is watching as you have sex. Jesus does not want you to masturbate. Homosexuality is a far greater sin than adultery. Women should cover themselves for modesty in the sight of the Lord. Women should be sexually available to their husbands under almost any condition. Sex outside of marriage is always wrong. Pornography is harmful to women and children. Religious leaders are equipped to counsel you on sex and marriage. Menstruation is dirty. You should not have sex with a menstruating woman. Teaching children and adolescents about sex will encourage them to actually do it. Teaching children about Jesus' plan will help them resist sexual temptation. Fantasizing is wrong. If you lust in your heart, you have committed adultery. No one else feels the sexual feelings you feel, so you must be sinful. Premarital sex will damage your marriage. Too much sex in marriage is wrong. Women don't enjoy sex. All men want from women is sex. Women are Jesus' sexual gatekeepers. Premarital purity and abstinence will help you have a long and happy marriage. Women who have a lot of sex partners are sluts. Men who have a lot of sex partners just use women. Women should be subservient to men. Anal sex is repulsive and wrong in the sight of God. Punishment for adultery is deserved. Women are the tempters and lead men astray. Oral sex is unnatural. God inserts the soul at the moment of conception. Sexual pleasure is dangerous. Ministers who go astray deserve forgiveness, just as Jesus commands. These myths and many more are part of the larger map of sex that we carry around in our heads. You may not believe most of these, but many people do. These myths have a direct impact on a person's ability to enjoy and develop sexually, and influence how they relate to and teach their children, and which politicians they vote for. One of the most pernicious Christian myths is the myth of monogamy. Myth: Christians are monogamous. Monogamy as the natural state is so deeply ingrained that most Christians and Jews are able to totally ignore the hundreds of wives and concubines of their God's most holy men, Solomon, David, Abraham, and many others. Indeed, monogamy, as Jesus defined it, is not even practiced among most Christians. Jesus defined monogamy as one sex partner for life. Matthew 5:31-32. It was also said, "Whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce. But I say to you that everyone who divorces his wife, except on grounds of unchastity, makes her commit adultery, and whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery." Other passages also make it clear that divorce is not an option, except in the most extreme cases of adultery. For example, Paul says in 1 Corinthians 7:10-11, "To the married I give this command, not I, but the Lord. A wife must not separate from her husband, but if she does, she must remain unmarried or else be reconciled to her husband. A husband must not divorce his wife. A woman is bound to her husband as long as he lives. But if her husband dies, she is free to marry anyone she wishes, but he must belong to the Lord." Just to make the point as clear as possible, Jesus said in Matthew 19:4-6, "Haven't you read," he replied, "that at the beginning the Creator made them male and female, and said, 'For this reason a man shall leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become flesh.' So they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no one separate." Premarital sex was not an option for Jesus or Paul.
Oh, what's up, gamer
Based
bro?
on this, the Christian view of monogamy has been one
Thank you for
partner
stopping by,
for
baby.
life, with the only exception being death of the spouse. Even in the case of adultery, the wrong spouse is not supposed to remarry. How many Christians today would fit into that definition of monogamy? Every Mormon who had premarital sex, every Baptist who's had an affair, every Catholic who's received an annulment, except for adultery, every person who remarried after a divorce, all are living a non-monogamous lifestyle. Newt Gingrich, former Speaker of the House and very conservative Catholic, has had 3 wives and who knows how many other partners. He's anything but monogamous, according to this definition. Is Ted Haggard, former president of the National Association of Evangelicals, monogamous? He admittedly had sex with a male prostitute. Is Earl Polk, megachurch evangelical minister, monogamous? It turns out, through DNA testing, that his, quote, nephew, unquote, is really his son.
Wow.
He had sex with his sister-in-law to father the son. The son, qua nephew, is now taking over the ministry. Having sex with your dead brother's wife was a biblical commandment, but Earl evidently couldn't wait until his brother died. Many members of Haggard and Polk's congregations are as non-monogamous as their leaders. Some would say that people like Newt Gingrich or the evangelist Joyce Meyer are serial monogamists. But the idea of serial monogamy makes no sense. Either one is monogamous or not, according to Christian tradition. So monogamy is a myth among most Christians. At least the Muslim men don't have to deal with that problem. They're permitted up to 4 wives, though Muhammad allowed himself many more. Myth: Jesus makes marriage better. Thousands of sermons have been preached on how to bring Jesus into your marriage. I've heard at least a dozen from ministers who eventually got caught in affairs or divorced themselves. A 2000 study by the evangelical researcher George Barna found that fundamentalists have the highest divorce rates. The leaders in divorce were non-denominational, Episcopal, Baptist, and Pentecostal. Not much evidence of Jesus present in those marriages. The divorce rates among ministers is roughly equal to that of the general population. If those who preach and teach about welcoming Jesus into their marriage show equal divorce rates, obviously the Jesus treatment isn't working. Dr. Roy Austin, a religious therapist and graduate of Southwestern Seminary, made this observation about the Barna study. Magical thinking is often a factor among evangelical and fundamentalist couples, and that leaves them less prepared for the rigors of marriage. The atheist doesn't believe in God, and so doesn't depend on God to save or fix a marriage. It's just the two of us, and that takes the magic aspect out of it. Carrie Thomas, author of Sacred Marriage and director of the Center for Evangelical Spirituality in Bellingham, Washington, says Christians should use marriage to seek holiness, not happiness. Mr. Thomas believes that the Christian church contributes to divorce by being too tolerant. Christians need to think of their marriage as a chance to serve Christ. A Christian who gets divorced puts their happiness before their devotion to Christ.
Damn right. You're supposed to put your
It is pretty easy to see how following this guy's Jesus might lead to marital unhappiness and divorce. These are just a few of the many myths religions perpetuate on their members. In the next chapters,
in other words, y'all excuse me, I'm trying to eat. In other words, damn what you're going through in your marriage. You could be being beat on. I ain't gonna put because you got women that abuse men. Your spouse can be abusing you physically, mentally, and I'm telling you, mental abuse most of the time is worse than physical abuse. Because when you do something to a person's mind, it takes you a long time to get, to get your psyche right. Those bruises and stuff heal, but that mind, it takes you a long time to get it back right. Your husband out there or your wife out there doing this and doing that, you still supposed to stay there if you're not happy. All because you believe in Christ. Come on with that bullshit.
Any more will be explored in different contexts. Chapter 4. Did Jesus masturbate? And other interesting thoughts.
Well.
Jesus, married, non-existent female, or closeted gay. The idea that a God is watching you during sex, knows when you're masturbating, and sees you when you look lustfully at another person comes from early Christian writings that are influenced by a strong anti-sexual mythology. The New Testament and the Ante-Nicene Fathers advised avoiding sex to make sure you don't fall into temptation. Christian writings and tradition make Jesus a virtual eunuch. Jesus was called rabbi. Throughout Jewish culture, a rabbi has been a married man, unless he's a widower. How could Jesus be a rabbi and not married?
That part.
It's highly unlikely for him to be single at age 30. Any wife would automatically make Jesus a
He was married to Mary Magdalene.
Sexual creature, especially if he had children. Being married or having children would interfere with the Christian narrative of Jesus as an asexual creature. Another possibility is that he was female, but was thought to be male. See also the discussion of androgen and sensitivity syndrome in chapter 10 later.
They can't even get their
If he was
lives
born
right.
a virgin, that means he was conceived through parthenogenesis. Parthenogenesis is the ability of a female to reproduce without being fertilized by male sperm. Unfortunately, the offspring of any parthenogenic human would be female, since that is all parthenogenesis ever produces. Therefore, biologically speaking, Jesus would have been female if the virgin birth were true. It is interesting to look at the whole virgin birth idea from a biological perspective. Sex is an unclean act. It's a theme throughout Christianity. How can the Savior be born of an unclean act? Such a thing could not be allowed in the sex-negative worldview of early Christianity. For this reason, there was some editing going on in the early writers to eliminate inconvenient facts. Wives, children, sexual conception, all would say that Jesus was a sexual creature, born of two other sexual creatures. But all this challenges the asexual perspective of the church. What happened to the women and children? And what about those who followed Jesus? In the Jewish culture of the day, marriage was an incredibly important thing, as it is today among most Jews, especially Orthodox. It is difficult to believe that most of Jesus' followers were not married. Peter certainly was, as we know from Luke 4:38, and Paul makes a clear reference to wives. Quote, "Don't we have the right to take a believing wife along with us, as do other apostles and the Lord's brothers and Cephas?" Corinthians 9:5. Most authorities would concede that at least some of them were married. But the wives were left out of the New Testament, and so were any children. Is it possible for such a large group of apostles and disciples not to have children? It has been suggested that Jesus and his disciples were all gay, hence no need for wives or children, but that seems a bit far-fetched. So what happened to the women and children? Ask a Christian biblical scholar, he might say, quote, "Women are not seen as important, so there was no need to refer to them," unquote. That answer has some validity, but male children were important. Where are the references to the sons of Peter or Paul, or the grandsons of John? Progeny are always a problem when there is a charismatic founder. Just look at the problems Muhammad's children and grandchildren caused. The split between Sunni and Shia Islam is, in part, a result of the battle for spiritual succession between the children of Muhammad and his key followers. And what about the split in Mormon Church between Joseph Smith's son and Brigham Young? In a patriarchal culture, sons have a claim to the property and reputation of their father, especially oldest sons. Just as Oral Roberts' son took over his empire, and Billy Graham's son took on his father's ministry, early Christians would have revered the sons and daughters of apostles. There could be no doubt that children and grandchildren existed. Paul would have known some of them, but his writings rarely mention the original apostles and never mention their children. As for Paul, a well-educated Jewish official, it would have been imperative for him to be married. Did he abandon his wife and children to wander around the Mediterranean, proselytizing for the new Christian cult? What happened to his children and grandchildren? Why were these people edited out? How did they get edited out? Inconvenient women and children. I suggest two reasons. First, the political inconvenience of having children on the record, and second, the importance of the asexual myth to Christianity. It is probable that some kind of struggle took place between the growing church hierarchy of the late first century and the grandchildren and great-grandchildren of the founders. Ultimately, the budding hierarchy won and did its best to erase the names of those who were descended from Jesus, Paul, Peter, and other important figures. Once the non-related leaders gained the upper hand, history was rewritten without wives, children, or grandchildren. The subsequent church's suppression of female figures in the Jesus story is good evidence that women in particular were edited out. The Gospels of Philip, Mary, and Pistis Sophia all have stories of conflict between Mary and Peter. In each story, Peter is said to oppose what Mary says because she is a woman. Yet these and many other writings show women played significant roles at one time. While several of these writings may have been rediscovered in recent times, like the Gospel of Mary, all these manuscripts date from the 200s to 500s CE. They were probably in wide circulation for the first 400 to 500 years of the church, and then eliminated. Dr. Richard Carrier, a scholar of ancient history, says, "Women were conspicuously important to the cult from day one. Paul has to thank several for providing funds and housing for his congregations and sets rules for their equal participation in the church." The Timothy letters and the anti-woman passage in Corinthians are forgeries and represent latter Christian misogyny, whereas Paul was nearly an egalitarian. And Acts makes a point of mentioning the role of numerous female converts. So the silence on disciples, wives, daughters, and mothers and kids is even more bizarre, according to Carrier. Many early writers had motivation to edit out any inconvenient or powerful women. The strong patriarchal model of early Christianity did not allow for powerful women, so it was best to edit these women out than to have questions later. Others simply forged new documents that mentioned no women or children. Tertullian, 160 to 220 CE, the father of Latin Christianity, has been revered and quoted by Christian scholars for centuries. He is amazingly misogynistic. With him setting the pace, it is no wonder that women were eliminated from the narrative where possible. Rewriting history. We have recent parallel examples of religion eliminating competing versions and rewriting the story while eliminating women. For example, the Mormon Church started rewriting its history before Joseph Smith was coaled in the ground, and it continues to rewrite it today. Ask a devout Mormon how many wives Joseph Smith or Brigham Young had. He probably won't tell you 34 and 54, respectively, plus or minus a few. Church officials deny or downplay plural marriage. Even Joseph Smith's wife, Emma Smith, denied her husband was polygamous and campaigned against it after he died. Yet, Brigham Young practiced polygamy and encouraged it among his followers in Utah. The church does not celebrate these women and children, though they played a big part in the early Mormon church. Catholicism has actively rewritten its history and that of others' versions of Christianity from the very beginning. For example, those who opposed the winners at the Council of Nicaea in 325 CE were edited and eliminated from the writings shortly thereafter. The heretic of the day was the Bishop of Alexander, Arius, 250 to 336. His so-called heresy had an enormous following, including 2 Roman emperors, but the winners wrote the history. Constantine ordered Arius's writings burned and suppressed, and thus we know little of him except through the denunciations of Catholic writers. Arian Christianity, along with its writers and thinkers, continued to thrive for another 100 years in some parts of the empire, but their writings have largely disappeared. Christian asexuality. The second reason to eliminate these inconvenient historical figures deals with sex and sexuality. In the Christian view, sex is an unclean act. Ask Christians, did Jesus have sex? And watch their nonverbal response. Or ask, did Peter enjoy sex with his wife? Or did Mary and Martha, whom Jesus loved, ever enjoy a good orgasm? Such questions do not compute in the Christian mind. The Christian founders are seen as asexual. Contrast these beliefs with Muslim beliefs about their founders' sexuality. Muhammad gives all sorts of advice on when to have sex, with whom to have sex, how to treat sexual slaves, etc. Mormon founders were also very sexual. In the Mormon pantheon, Jesus is even married. Mormonism started out as polygamous, but as Mormonism attempted to become more accepted within the greater Christian culture, it evolved into an asexual cult as well. Unlike some other religions, asexuality is so important to Christianity that it has written and rewritten its history to reflect the non-sexual nature of its founders. The asexual ideal of Christianity allows it to assign guilt to anyone who falls short of this ideal. Mary was a virgin. The appearance of asexuality was so important that even the mother of Jesus had to be a virgin. The Catholic Church vehemently denies that Jesus had any brothers or sisters, despite the mention in Mark 6:3. If Mary had other children, then she would have participated in the unclean act of sexual intercourse and would not be the pure and undefiled person of Catholic mythology. It is upon this mythology that entire components of the Catechism are built. Mary was not married to Joseph. She was married to God, and a God impregnated her. Joseph was just a convenience to give cover for the potential embarrassment that Mary was really a sexually active adolescent who got pregnant with her boyfriend. According to church doctrine, the marriage was never consummated, and Joseph didn't hang around long. Mary was a virgin before, during, and after the birth of Christ. Catechism of the Catholic Church.
Exactly. See how that Bible contradicts itself? A bunch of damn hypocrites.
Edition translation, page 496 to 511. No mention is made of Joseph after Jesus' incident in the temple when he was 12. This plays out in current sexual distortion with respect to nuns. Nuns are celibate and are married to Jesus. They also practice a good deal of Mary worship. Many nuns and priests, as well as the Pope himself, worship Mary above Jesus. Although they would deny this, a look at their behavior says otherwise.
Yep.
When Pope John Paul II was shot, during his ride to the hospital, he kept repeating, "Mary, my mother." A year after he was shot, he made a pilgrimage to Fatima to give thanks to Mary for his recovery. While we have focused on Catholic doctrine, ideas like the virgin birth also inform the Orthodox and Protestant branches. There may be nuances and differences, but the one thing they all hold in common is the asexuality of the founders. For example,
Brother Charles,
the Nicene Creed is common to all and contains this fundamental concept: who for us men and for our salvation came down from heaven and was incarnate by the Holy Ghost of the Virgin Mary and was made man. So as well does the Apostles' Creed, which many Protestants use. I believe in God, the Father Almighty.
Oh, well, I'm sorry, y'all. They didn't mean to cut it off. I was trying to get this screen right. It'll come right back on.
Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, and of Jesus Christ, his only Son, our Lord, who was conceived by the Holy Spirit.
You see how that Bible contradicts itself? That's how I knew from a child. Even though I was being a preacher's kid, I still knew something wasn't right.
Born of the Virgin Mary. There are other minor variations on the creeds, but all refer to the Virgin Mary. The creeds were originally designed to standardize beliefs and to prosecute or eliminate those who did not adhere to key ideas. Modern non-denominationalists claim that they have no creed, but queried on the validity of a virgin birth, they will respond, "That's what the Bible says, so it must be true." Knowing that early Christian founders were human, we can conclude that they masturbated, married, had sex, had children, had affairs occasionally, and certainly lusted in their hearts. But in Christian scriptures, the founders seem untouched by human desires.
How you doing tonight, brother?
There's only the slightest hint that Paul experienced a problem when, in Corinthians, he talks about a thorn in his flesh. We can only guess what he's referring to. Maybe he masturbated too much, drank a little too much wine, or had a mistress. He wouldn't be the first religious leader to do so.
I'm spiritual, not religious. It's a difference.
The single-handed sin. As with most religions, Christianity teaches that masturbating is wrong or at best questionable. Mark Driscoll, founder of the Seattle megachurch Mars Hill, is only one among many religious leaders who preach against masturbation. He says, masturbation can be a form of homosexuality because it is a sexual act that does not involve a woman.
But guess what though? They kept them all, but who all molesting all these boys and stuff? Them Catholic priests.
If a man were to masturbate while engaged in other forms of sexual intimacy with his wife, then he would not be doing so in a homosexual way. However, any man who does so without his wife in the room is bordering on homosexual activity, particularly if he's watching himself in the mirror and being turned on by his own male body. Self-sex is the first sex a person has. To characterize it as abnormal is a distortion of natural sexuality. Sooner or later, a child will hear that this most
straight mind control,
private and most important sexual activity is unnatural and will likely cause problems in his or her spiritual growth marriage, or eyesight. Jesus' idea that lust in the heart is the same as adultery feeds right into the guilt around masturbation. Masturbation generally involves some degree of imagination and visualization. Lucky for women, adultery as Jesus knew it was between a man and a married woman. A single woman could not commit adultery. Also, the Bible does not prohibit women from masturbating, though most Christian denominations would frown on it. The idea of adultery was directly related to a man's property rights. The prohibition is to prevent one man from interfering with another's property, as in Exodus 20:14. You shall not commit adultery. And 17, you shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, or male or female slave, or ox, or donkey, or anything that belongs to your neighbor. Why are Jews monogamous? Interestingly, there is nothing in the Ten Commandments about the number of spouses you can have. At the time of the writing of Exodus and Deuteronomy, polygamy was well accepted and practiced by Judaism and surrounding cultures. Under Rome in the 1st century CE, the monogamous Romans were tolerant of polygamous Jews. Herod the Great was allowed to have many wives because he was Jewish. There was no outcry at that time against Herod's behavior because it was an acceptable practice. As with many cultures, polygamy was generally practiced by the upper classes, since it required excess resources to support multiple wives. Even when polygamy was most widely practiced, most Jews would still have been monogamous, just as a practical matter. Probably as a result of 300 years of domination by the monogamous Greeks and Romans, polygamy slowly lost favor in the upper classes. But polygamy was not formally outlawed in Judaism until the 11th century. Why are Christians monogamous? Jesus said nothing against polygamy, even though he undoubtedly saw it practiced by his Jewish contemporaries. No later Christian author in the New Testament condemns the practice either. A reference in 1 Timothy 3:12 indicates polygamy was practiced among Christians. Deacons must be husbands of only one wife. Some Christians must have had more than one wife. Otherwise, why make that a requirement? The world of early Christianity was a mix of monogamous and polygamous practices, both inside and outside of Judaism. As Christianity spread to non-Jewish communities in the Roman world, many would already have been monogamous, so polygamy would not be an issue. But in polygamous North Africa and the Arabian Peninsula, accommodations had to be made. The church may have disapproved of polygamy, but conversion was more important at that time. Once an area was converted, then the church slowly went about forcing out polygamy. It was too much to ask that a wealthy polygamous convert give up 2 of his 3 wives, but the church could ask that his sons refrain from marrying more than one wife. As a result, the early church was largely silent on the issue, so as not to alienate possible converts and gain access to their wealth. Christian views on monogamy are not based on scripture, and early church leaders had difficulty condemning polygamy. All the key players in the Old Testament were polygamous. Augustine, 354 to 430 CE, did not condemn the patriarchs for their polygamous ways, but said polygamy was no longer necessary. He created a tortured argument and taught that the reason why patriarchs had many wives was simply because they wanted more children. Therefore, he said that the need to produce many children was past, so monogamy was more acceptable. He never actually condemned polygamy. If you're confused by this argument, you're not alone. Some Christians were probably polygamous for the first few centuries, but Christianity was more a movement of the lower classes who were monogamous already. Thus, from the beginning, monogamy would have been the norm simply because it was a lower class religion. It was not until the 5th century that the church formally outlawed it. Then it became a bedrock principle. But the issue was still cropping up in Martin Luther's time, 1,000 years after Augustine. In a letter to Chancellor Greg Brooke, January 13th, 1524, Luther said, "I confess that I cannot forbid a person to marry several wives, for it does not contradict Scripture." Modern-day Christian culture ignores the fact there is no prohibition on polygamy, or accurately, polygyny, many wives, or for that matter, polyandry, many husbands. In matters of marriage, the Bible is largely silent. The Mormons had no problem with polygyny. They believed that Jesus had 3 wives. Joseph Smith instituted polygyny from the very beginning. As we can see from the polygyny of Mormonism, Hinduism, and Islam, religions can be quite successful with non-monogamous forms of marriage. Christian monogamy was a function of the cultural pressures of the first 3 centuries. At the same time, a severe type of monogamy evolved in Christianity. Sexual pleasure within marriage is not discussed or encouraged in the New Testament. The ante-Nicene Fathers were downright hostile to the notion of sexual pleasure. Their belief that Jesus may return any day to judge you meant that you had better be sexually pure at all times, or you might end up in hell. The concept of an all-knowing, voyeuristic, and vengeful God created a religion of strong guilt and fear around sex. So to answer the question we began with in the title of this chapter, did Jesus masturbate? If he existed, he probably did at some point in his adolescence. It would be the rare boy who does not experiment with his own body. On the other hand, some people are born asexual. If Jesus was asexual, he might have never have masturbated. Jesus said in Matthew 19:12, "For some are eunuchs because they were born that way. Others were made that way by men, and others have renounced marriage because of the kingdom of heaven. The one who can accept this should accept this." Maybe he was a eunuch from birth. In that case, how can a eunuch give advice about sex and marriage? Now let's turn to the mechanics of shame and guilt to help us understand why sex is so important to most religions and why they use it so much.
I heard that, boo.
Chapter 5, the shame of it all. Shame versus guilt. Religious guilt and shame are the primary tools of most organized religions, but they're used to different degrees and ways. Why does Islam or Hinduism use one sexual system and Christianity another?
Right.
Much of the answer to this question may be found in how these religions use shame and guilt. For purposes of our discussion, let's define religious guilt as the feeling you get when you know you have violated a rule or moral principle. No one else may know of your action.
I ain't never felt guilty when I had me some good love.
But an all-voyeuristic God knows. Guilt is something that, once programmed, can function without anyone else knowing. If you're taught that masturbation is against God's law, then whenever you do it, you will feel guilt, even though no one knows you did it. Shame is a deeper emotion, one that incorporates one's identity as well as the judgment of other people. It is the idea that a certain behavior makes you a bad, damaged, or diseased person. A Muslim woman is taught from birth that anyone who loses her virginity before marriage is eternally damaged. She becomes like a diseased and filthy person to God and her community. Such a belief creates both terror and focus on avoiding behavior that might lead to shame. She is told stories and shown examples of women who violated this law of God. In everyday conversation, the idea is associated with defilement, dirt, disease, as well as loss of social connection, status, and support. A defiled woman is the target of social ostracism and abuse. It is remarkably parallel to the button story of chapter 1.
That's what I told my barber today when I went to go get my tape up. He finna turn 85, so when I got there, he was just opening up the shop, and he said, "Well, I got to go here and use the bathroom." And he was in there a long time, so when he came out, I said, "Oh boy, what took you so long?" I said, "If you shake it over more than 2 times, you're playing with it."
This is an entirely different level of programming than guilt. With shame, the very thought of engaging in a given behavior evokes association of disease and ostracism. Actually doing the behavior creates huge emotional turmoil. Feelings of filth and uncleanliness may overwhelm the person, making him or her feel worthless. In other words, shame leaves a deep psychological mark. Here's a story that illustrates this point from an American Muslim woman who is now an atheist. When I started maturing, my mother came into my room, sat down, and said, "Never touch yourself, it will ruin your marriage." That was the extent of my sex education. I knew what she meant, but I had never had the urge at that point. Over the next year, I began to have urges and thoughts. I resisted doing anything for almost 2 years. Then one night I succumbed and gave myself my first orgasm. The next morning I was so ashamed that I became sick. I stayed home from school. I cannot express the feelings of filth, disgust, and horror that I experienced. I was afraid that I had already ruined my marriage at 14 years of age. I wondered if my future husband would be able to tell and would reject me. Not long after, I became very religious. I hoped to show my devotion to Allah and find a way out of my shame. While I mostly resisted, every so often I would succumb, and the whole process would start again with an even stronger devotion to Allah. Fortunately, this woman left Islam and happily masturbates or has sex with her boyfriend without any shame or guilt.
I know that's right.
Her ordeal, however, is shared by millions of women.
I tell you, I ain't never felt bad after getting me some good goddamn dick. Good dick and good head. It always made me glad.
Islam, as well as Christianity, Hinduism, Mormonism, and many other religions. Due to its deep-rooted nature, shame is far harder to erase than guilt. The shamed person actually creates a new identity that incorporates a permanent condition of defilement. Guilt may be forgiven with a prayer or confession, but shame indelibly marks the identity. The shamed person may feel so defiled or diseased that she may engage in irrational, self-defeating behaviors. Often, she dives deeper into religion, hoping to get some relief. Shame is often more destructive than guilt, which is why I will focus on it here. Shame and the family. Shame invokes a stronger response from family and community than guilt. A girl may be guilty of disobeying her mother. She may feel guilt, and her mother may be angry. She may do extra housework or cooking to get back in her mother's good graces and then move on. But for a person who violates a shame rule, no amount of penance or praying will wash the spot clean. No amount of forgiveness from mother or father will cleanse the shameful action. Additionally, other people in the community, especially the family, take on the dirt and filth identity. As a result, the girl or woman, and it is mostly focused on women in shaming cultures,
That's right,
is punished and isolated like a leper. In ancient Greece, the word eidos,
you know, right now in this society, in this culture. Well, since I've been old enough to know anything about sex and all that, hearing about it, it always was a man could go out there and do anything they wanted to do. Nothing would ever be said about them. If they said anything, it wasn't nothing bad. It would seem like it was celebrated for men to go out there and be whores. But you let a woman go out there, boy, she's the lowest. She's lower than dirt. She's a slut. She's a whore. She's a bitch. She's this. She's that. But men can go out there and they can screw 1,000 women and nothing to be said about it.
shame, applied to men and women, but with a sexual meaning for women and a more honor meaning for men. Men could be shamed on the battlefield. Women were shamed sexually. According to Greek legend, the goddess Askina gave people a sense of
Yeah,
shame
yeah,
so they
exactly.
would avoid certain behaviors. In the New Testament, which was originally written in Greek, aidos is only used twice. Once in reference to female modesty, so as not to bring shame on
That's it.
themselves or the community. The other reference is non-specific.
Look
1 Timothy 2:9. In
here,
like manner
I was
also,
hell back
that
when
women
I was
adorn
hell when I
themselves
was
in
a
modest
damn
apparel, with
tenderoni.
shamefacedness and sobriety, not with braided hair or gold or pearls or costly array. At different times in history, Christianity has used shame as an important tool, but the use of shame often requires a tight knit community or tribe that can punish violators. With the Protestant Reformation, the idea of the priesthood of all believers pushed Christianity away from shame and more toward guilt. Protestants were held accountable directly to their God and must ask Him for forgiveness, not a priest or church official. This idea reduced the emphasis on community and increased focus on the individual. That is probably why Christianity, especially Protestantism, places a stronger emphasis on guilt than on shame. Islam, the shame religion.
Yeah, now
In
them
the
Muslims,
West,
hell
many
now.
people marvel at the power of Islam to control people and oppress women so completely that
Mm-hmm.
they will wear head to toe clothing in 100-degree, 38 centigrade
Yep.
heat. Islam has a very different
And
approach.
if you notice when Brother Malcolm, may he rest in peace, you know, in the movie when he confronted Muhammad, and he talked about he must sow his seed in fertile soil. I said, God damn. What
Sexual
the hell? What
control
the
in
hell?
Christianity, and the two approaches are rooted in their beginnings. Islam began as a tribal religion, whereas Christianity began more as an individual or family religion. Christianity struck out from Palestine, converting one person or one family at a time. After the initial successes and conquest by Muhammad and his tribe, conversions were as much military as spiritual. Muhammad was both a political and military genius and used his success and charisma to convince the superstitious tribes around him that he had Allah on his side. As such, the sword was the instrument of persuasion. Often an entire tribe converted to Islam.
What's going on, Tito?
In the Arabian Peninsula, there were Jewish, Christian, and pagan tribes. The division and conflicts among the many tribes helped Muhammad gain ascendancy and ultimately control. Muhammad took his tribal customs and traditions and injected them into his new religion. Many of the ideas and traditions he implemented were already contained in the tribes he conquered. So, in many cases, no major changes were required of his followers.
How you doing tonight, love?
For example, most, if not all, of the
I'm doing
tribes
well.
were polygamous. Women were seen primarily as chattel and under the complete control of their husbands or fathers. The communities of the new Islamic religion in the 600 CE often converted en masse. With minor
This
modifications,
is a good
they
one.
kept
You know,
practicing their
I'm
traditions.
always gonna find some
Mecca
good
was
good
already a
this
major pagan religious shrine.
this,
Muhammad
I will always
conveniently
find out
changed it
that
to a
fight
place of worship and pilgrimage for Allah. Practically speaking, Muhammad unified a fractured region under a single religion and did it with superior military power. Conquest, war, and male dominance were the hallmarks of Islam. Despite political splits over the centuries, the tribal nature of Islam remains intact. In contrast, Christianity started out as an underground movement. Christianity did not have the strong and solid tribal roots of Islam. While it may have originated in Judaism, it rapidly left those tribal roots behind. For more than 3 centuries, it had to hide or run from Roman authorities, did not come into its own until the 400s. In many ways, Islam looks much more like the tribes of ancient Israel than does Christianity. Reading an Old Testament and the Quran side by side,
You
the
know,
rules and commandments are remarkably
you know,
similar.
Big Chief and Brother
Both
Charles,
allow, even command, the
they
killing
be
of
sitting
those
back
who do not
listening.
bow
See,
to their God. Both allow for sex slaves.
that's what I'm
Here's
doing
some
because I'm
examples.
listening because
Exodus
he dropping some
21:7
real
through 11.
fire.
When a man sells his daughter as a slave, she will not be freed at the end of 6 years as men are.
This audio book, we just on this audio book so long I had to download it in different parts. And we still on the first part, and still got another 2 hours left just on this part. Then I got another second part. Then I still got to download 2 more because this audio book is almost 10 hours long. So that's why I'm not going to be doing a whole lot of talking. Or we're just going to be listening. I know you're here, but I'm not going to be doing a whole lot of talking.
If she does not please the man who bought her, he may allow her to be bought back again. But he is not allowed to sell her to foreigners, since he is the one who broke the contract with her. And if the slave girl's owner arranges for her to marry his son, he may no longer treat her as a slave girl, but he must treat her as his daughter. If he himself marries her and then takes another wife, he may not reduce her food or clothing or fail to sleep with her as his wife. If he fails in any of these 3, she may leave as a free woman without making any payment. In the Quran, Surah 24, the Light, verse 31, and say to the believing woman that they cast down their looks and guard their private parts, and do not display their ornaments except what appears thereof, and let them wear their head coverings over their bosoms, and do not display their ornaments except to their husbands and their fathers, or their fathers of their husbands, or their sons, or the sons of their husbands, or their brothers' sons, or their sisters' sons, or their women, or those whom their right hand possesses, which means female sex slaves, or the male servants not having need of women. Both give the male head of the family total control and treat women as property with economic and political value. Both are strongly patriarchal and punish women more than men for sexual transgressions. Both have a strong shame focus. The modern approach of Christianity, based on individualistic guilt, does not allow it to stone people, chop off their heads, or shame them into becoming suicide bombers. Were Christianity in a position to put women to death for wearing a bikini or failing to fast during Lent, there would be far less secularism. That is the advantage of Islam. Fail to fast during Ramadan in Iran or Saudi Arabia or any number of other countries, and you risk bodily harm, to say nothing of wearing a bikini. How does Islam accomplish this? From birth, its adherents are deeply infected with ideas of honor and shame. When communities of Muslims develop in new countries, they form tight communities that facilitate enforcement of religious principles. If possible, they even set up alternative courts to enforce Sharia law. How is this different from the Irish in New York or the Indians in London? The answer is that while such subcultures have their own customs and traditions, none ever successfully implemented separate systems of enforcement equal to the Muslim communities. The murder of Theo van Gogh, the fatwa on Salman Rushdie, the death threats to the former Dutch parliamentarian Ayaan Hirsi Ali, the riots, death threats, and killings over the Muhammad cartoons, the honor killings of young women in Holland, are all examples of the shame culture in Islam in action. The simple psychology of shame uses early childhood terror and natural defensive mechanisms to ensure conformity. Sanctions do not need to occur often. As long as children see and hear of them occasionally, they will internalize them. Westerners are horrified at the public beheadings in Saudi Arabia, or stories of young girls being killed by their own brothers or fathers for running off with a boyfriend. A Muslim father in Toronto killed his daughter for defying him and riding her boyfriend. Imagine what such stories do to Muslim children who live inside the culture and communities, even in Western countries. In the secular West, we know such things will not happen to us. Children in Muslim cultures have no such assurances. Even if they have kind, loving, less religious parents, they're still finely tuned to their religion. They easily internalize the terror that such a fate would befall them if they do not adhere to the dictates of Allah. Male shame. While men may not suffer shame as much as women, it is still a constant force in the lives of Muslims. Males are responsible for the chastity of all women in their household, for defending the faith, and for avenging insults to the religion. They must show courage in battle so as not to bring shame on their families or communities. The male side of Islamic shame requires punitive measures for anyone who would bring imagined filth upon Allah or Muhammad. Therefore, men are compelled to ensure purity within their family and community. Today, Islam effectively resists secularization, primarily because of its use of shame. Within the community, each person's sexuality is tied to his or her family and to the community. To violate the sexual rules of Allah violates both the family and the community. This powerful distortion allows Islam to remain isolated from secular sexual influences. The terror of social sanction or violence keeps young people from following their heart. It prevents healthy sexual exploration and development in men and women. Shame and modern cults. Modern cults like Mormonism, Jehovah's Witnesses, and Scientology are more shame-based than mainstream Christian cults. Cults tend to create a closed community where members are isolated from the rest of the world through deep indoctrination. At the same time, the system requires members to watch one another and report violations of behavior or doctrine to an authority figure. Shame can be brought upon the family for one person's behavior. For example, if a Jehovah's Witness sees another committing a sin, he is obligated to report it to the elders. Two elders then investigate the incident. If they determine a violation has happened, a three-elder committee meets with the member in a disciplinary meeting. The discipline can be anything from a mild reproach to a public announcement at the meeting to being disfellowshipped. During the discipline meeting, the person is encouraged to reveal if he or she has witnessed others committing sin. The idea is that a person cannot be guilt-free if he has seen others sinning and not reported it. Unlike Islam, Jehovah's Witnesses have to work in a culture that has competing religions and many secular influences. It is a major task to keep the members isolated from outside ideas. Guilt and shame are the main tools. Conclusion. Lest I overstate the case, shame is not limited to religion. It can be used without reference to religion or the supernatural. But religions have found shame to be a powerful tool for maintaining religious conformity and to control or limit sexual behavior. Building on our understanding of these psychological tools, let's look at how these come together to allow many of the...
I ain't saying I ain't gonna stop it every now and then, but I ain't gonna be doing too many frequent stops. But I had to say this on that Jehovah's Witness thing. See, I'm a fan of true crime, and I have seen women, especially women. They had the Jehovah's Witness. They shamed the women so bad. They indoctrinated them, had them so brainwashed. I seen one woman kill her whole family and herself, and including the damn dog, all because of the damn Jehovah's Witnesses.
Abuses perpetuated by religion. Chapter 6. Mind police and thought control. Religious police. Saudi Arabia has religious police charged with maintaining the public morals. They arrest people who are in violation of the religious dress or behavior codes of the kingdom. Thus, if two people kiss in public, they're subject to arrest and prosecution by the religious authorities. If a woman is not properly covered in public, she is seen as a public danger and prosecuted for exposing an ankle or face. Consequences can be severe for both the individual and the family. As we discussed in Chapter 4, shame is an enormously effective tool because it brings communal pressure to bear on both the individual and the family. While we may be horrified at the notion of religious police, there are ways to control by different means. The guilt cycle is an effective method for creating self-policing and self-censorship. It works like this. The guilt cycle, or the police officer in your head. Each religion has certain things that are forbidden or sinful. Children are taught these with many examples, stories, and subtle signals as they grow up. In the area of sex, the secretiveness, subtle language, and behavior of adults, and occasional public examples, all work to infect a child with fear of transgression. Also, punishments, ostracism, and humiliation often occur when sexual behavior is discovered or suspected, ensuring that these lessons are internalized. If a person violates the code, there is no way to hide. That God knows you did it, even if your parents do not, and that God will punish you unless you confess. These are powerful ideas for a child. Children are very susceptible to magical thinking at 3 to 7 years of age, when they're being taught magical ideas about God's watching or punishing them. It is a pattern of thinking that is embedded in the child's mind and often continues in adulthood. Fast forward to today. A child learns that you must pray for forgiveness when you do something bad. If you do not pray or do not confess, God will punish you. This scenario sets up the guilt cycle. When you transgress or sin, you must return to your personal religion for forgiveness. Catholics do not confess their sins to Baptist ministers. Baptists don't ask for forgiveness from Muslim clerics. You must seek forgiveness from the place where you learned about the sin. It is as if the religion infects you with the disease, then gives you a fake cure. The former Muslim, now atheist, Ayan Hirsi Ali, gives a perfect example of the guilt cycle in her excellent book, Infidel, 2007. A popular local imam, Abshir, began spending time with her. In his sermons, he preached strongly against intimacy before marriage and sinful thoughts, but his behavior was somewhat different. Ali says, I was having more and more sinful thoughts. When we were alone, Abshir would kiss me, and he could really kiss. It was long and gentle and thrilling, and therefore sinful. Afterwards, I would tell him how bad I felt in the eyes of Allah, how much that bothered me. And Abshir would say, if we were married, then it wouldn't be sinful. We must exercise willpower and not do it anymore. So for a day or so, we would steel ourselves and refrain, and then the next day we would look at each other and just kiss again. He would say, I'm too weak. I think of you all day long. She concluded, in hindsight, I don't think of Abshir as a creep at all. He was just as trapped in the mental cage as I was. Abshir and I, and all other young people who joined the Muslim Brotherhood movement, wanted to live as much as possible like our beloved Prophet. But the rules of the last messenger of Allah were too strict, and their very strictness led us to hypocrisy. At the time, though, I could see only either Abshir or Islam was thoroughly flawed, and of course, I assumed it was Abshir. Sexual drive pushes a person in one direction. Religion uses the guilt cycle to push back. The internal conflict creates misery and self-blame, leading right back to the religion. An effectively infected person will learn from childhood the things that are sinful and develop an internal moral police force to keep watch on all thoughts and deeds. This is not the same as a conscience. People develop a conscience with or without religion. Our culture teaches murder and cheating are wrong. We don't need a religion to know this. Guilt comes from a different place in our mental experience, a place that is independent of general cultural training and directly related to religious indoctrination. That is why two people may feel guilt about different things, while being equally convinced that cheating and murder are wrong. A simple mental experiment will illustrate this. Mary, a Catholic, was raised from birth to go to Mass and pray each week. If she misses Mass, she feels guilty. Sally, a Presbyterian from childhood, was taught that church attendance is good, but not mandatory. If she misses church, she doesn't feel too guilty about it as long as she has a good excuse, like visiting her elderly grandmother. Judy, an atheist from birth, wouldn't dream of wasting a Sunday in church and feels no guilt whatsoever. All three women firmly believe that cheating and murder are wrong and abhor such behavior. This thought experiment shows how each religion imprints a unique guilt pattern on their adherents, but has no bearing on whether a person is law-abiding or moral. Of course, there's also non-religious guilt. We usually feel it when we make a bad choice or mistreat someone. But non-religious guilt is directly related to widely held cultural expectations, whereas religious guilt is clearly related to a specific religion. Using this model, it is possible to learn what people feel guilty about and trace it directly back to religious childhood training. Religious training may lead people to feel guilty when I don't put money in the offering plate at church. I promise to pray for someone, then forget when I say my prayers. I use the Lord's name in vain. I think a lustful thought. I know someone needs to be saved, and I don't witness to them. I walk by a beggar and don't put any money in his can. I forget to bring my Bible to church. I don't do what the Lord wants me to do, like go to the hospital and visit the sick. I don't spend enough time preparing my Sunday school lesson. I pray for selfish things. I put my loved ones above others. I feel conflicted over a decision, knowing that if I were a better Mormon, Christian, or Muslim, the answer would be very clear to me. This list could go on and on. Religious guilt is a bottomless pit. The distinction between religious guilt and the more generic cultural guilt is important in understanding how religion impacts the mental life of religious people. Having a religious police officer in your head makes the job of keeping you infected with religion much easier. No religious police required. Sex and guilt. Growing up in a religious environment, children learn what not to do sexually. They learn that some practices or ideas, such as homosexuality, lust, masturbation, and pornography, are sinful. These ideas are embedded in the minds of children years before they are ready for marriage. So it's no surprise that many religious people have little or no experience with sex and know little about their sexuality. The guilt cycle that results from this training creates a form of self-censorship. Because so many acts and ideas are liable to lead to eternal damnation, people have a strong incentive to avoid expressing or discussing secretly held ideas and interests. Fear leads to hidden thoughts and activities and prevents normal, appropriately channeled sexual expression. It's like damming a river. Sooner or later, the water will flow around or over the dam. Controlled release allows for benefits like recreation and irrigation and less potential destruction downstream. Simply damming water leads to problems. Sexually inhibited or frustrated people will eventually express sexual energy, but in ways that may be destructive of self or others. They may condemn those who express themselves freely and attempt to impose religious restrictions on them. They may become inappropriately aggressive towards others or have secret affairs that undermine their family and relationships. Worst of all, they may physically, verbally, or sexually abuse those who are more vulnerable. Ignoring sexual drive and energy is a dam without a flood control plan. Religious guilt can take a normal, straightforward drive and distort it into unrecognizable forms. Many a church has angry, gossipy women in the kitchen who have not had sex in years. Many a male church elder has been known to abuse his wife or children. The incidence of sexual acting out on the part of important church members is not reflected in clergy abuse statistics. It seems reasonable that church members engage in at least as much sexual acting out as clergy. This is not to say that everyone in a church is acting out sexual frustration, but there are many, as we might suspect from the divorce statistics discussed in Chapter 3 and the porn and child abuse statistics we will discuss next. There is no way to quantify the sexual behavior of a religious people because the behavior is so easily hidden. But if priests can get away with sexual child abuse for decades and ministers have illicit affairs for years, even fathering children with church members, why wouldn't this be happening with many others in the church? A 2005 study by John Hewells compiled over 100 other studies that strongly connected parental religiosity with child abuse. Over the course of 30 years, I saw dozens of quiet scandals among the laity. The issue came to glaring clarity for me when 3 lay church officials from 2 different churches were caught in various forms of inappropriate or abusive behavior in the same week. One man was found to have abused his own children from a young age. A key woman had a child that was not fathered by her husband, but by one of the ministers. Another long-serving and upstanding, quote, family values, unquote, leader was exposed and pushed out of the church for homosexual behavior. It is time to acknowledge that sex is happening all the time among church members, but it is hidden, secret, and all too often exploitative or abusive. 3 statistics bear this out. First, in the United States, the most religious areas of the nation have the highest divorce rates. Second, one of the best predictors of child abuse and sexual abuse is the religiosity of the parents. The more religious the parents, the more likely they are to abuse their children. Third, the states with the highest porn use are Utah and Mississippi. Mormon Utah tops all states in internet porn in each of 4 different measures. Generally speaking, the more religiously conservative United States and zip codes have the highest porn use by a small margin. In the most religious areas, the only time porn use drops is on Sunday, but it more than catches up in the rest of the week. Could these 3 statistics be related to religiously dammed up sexual desire? Could these be proxies for the effects of religious sexual repression? Seems to point in that direction. Now let's look at how religious sexual guilt impacts women more strongly than men. Women, the guilty sex. Gender differences are evident in infants with respect to emotional expression, social interaction, and social contagion. That is, infant girls are more attentive than boys to the emotional states of their mothers and those of other children. This heightened sensitivity to the emotional environment seems to be genetically based. Throughout life, women interact more, talk more, and listen more than boys and men. Women are generally more tuned into the emotional environment than men. This seems to be true at all ages and in all cultures. This general tendency for women to be sensitive to the emotional environment means they imbibe emotional messages and cultural ideas more easily and rapidly than men. Religion takes advantage of this tendency by creating guilt messages that are uniquely targeted at women. All major religions put most of the responsibility for sexual morality on women. Religions teach that women should remain chaste and should control and hide their sexuality, so men will not be tempted. Once a woman is infected with ideas of chastity, modesty, and sexual morality, she is more susceptible to guilt when these are violated, or she imagines that they have been violated. If the woman gives in to the man, it is her fault. If she tempts a man, it is her fault. Some religions even blame the woman if she is raped. Sarah Hargraves, a rape counselor and group facilitator, writes, "Women agonize over Matthew 6:14 through 16. For if you forgive men when they sin against you, your heavenly Father will also forgive you. But if you do not forgive men their sins, your Father will not forgive your sins. She goes on to say, they torture themselves trying to forgive the person who humiliated and terrorized them. Or worse yet, they stifle their genuine emotions because they believe forgiveness is the magic cure for fixing their anger and resentment. If they cannot forgive their attacker, something is wrong with them, and they will not be able to heal. These are frankly crazy ideas because it assumes the rapist is worthy of forgiveness. With this intense programming, women experience religious sexual guilt more often and more strongly than men. They're encouraged to get relief by going to their religion. They're told it is their duty to forgive, or they are not worthy of Jesus. These religious ideas are the ultimate distortion. Women can pray, attend services, go to Mass, do Bible study, go to women's religious meetings, but the fact remains they are guilty of being a woman. Just as Eve was guilty of the fall of man, all women are guilty in the context of Christianity and Islam, as well as many other religions. Further, religions often teach that women are responsible for children's moral development. Not taking their children to church is a sign of moral neglect. The guilt messages are so strong that even non-religious mothers have been known to take their children to church or send them. In the church, children are exposed to abstinence-only messages, purity rings, and most of all, messages about female responsibility in most sexual matters. Alan Miller and John Hoffman looked at gender differences in religiosity as a function of risk aversion. The more risk averse a person is, the higher his or her religiosity and church attendance. In other words, risk averse people don't want to take a chance on getting on the wrong side of God. This would fit well with our guilt hypothesis. Women who are most afraid of divine consequences, as taught in shame and guilt training, are more likely than men to engage in fear and guilt reducing activities like attending church. Men who are less fearful of divine retribution or less risk averse see less need to be involved in religion. Christopher Hitchens articulated a similar argument in a recent speech. The loss of a child is incredibly traumatic to a woman. No doubt men are traumatized as well, but it is the woman who carries the baby to term and spends much of her waking hours with the child. She has the strongest bond. If a woman thinks that there is even a tiny advantage in preserving her child through prayer or giving to a priest, she will do so. I cannot blame her. I can blame the priest for taking advantage of such a deeply held love and devotion for his own gain. This is a powerful psychological argument that explains why mothers are often more concerned with taking children to church and teaching them religious ideas than fathers. How guilt disrupts sexual communication. The guilt cycle also works well to inhibit sexual communication between religious married people and keep them feeling both guilty and sexually frustrated. Here's how it works. Sexual preferences develop, evolve, and change over a lifetime. Some marry before they recognize they are homosexual. Others find their spouse has a frustratingly high or low sex drive. Or they discover that they have a fetish. Without opportunities for sexual exploration and discovery, how is a 19 or 20-year-old to learn what he or she likes or how his or her body reacts? The younger a religious person is when she gets married, the less she understands and knows about her sexuality. Add to this the incredible fear of talking about sexual fantasies, masturbation, experimentation, and pornography, and a young adult enters marriage with a serious handicap that can inhibit sexual development for life. Such people have no template for communication except through their guilt-based training. Interacting and working with hundreds of people, I have found a huge difference in the sexual skill level of religious newlyweds and newlyweds raised in a secular environment. The former are often groping in the dark, sometimes literally. Even if they do have some experience or skill with regard to sex and sexuality, they're often reluctant to display it for fear of giving away previous sexual experience. The abstinence only programs and reclaimed virginity movement make men and women ashamed of being sexual creatures before or outside of marriage. For a woman, the result is denial, even as she is having sex with her husband. If she was successfully abstinent before marriage, she enters into sex with great ignorance. Her husband dares not speak of any partners he has had, since it would quickly betray a double standard. Since it is highly likely that one or both had partners before marriage, they start their relationship on a lie. A woman who, quote, reclaims her virginity, unquote, is buying into the same guilt. Aside from the ludicrous idea that one can reclaim virginity or innocence, it is simply religion's attempt to inject guilt and control sexuality. Should the woman remarry, how does she communicate about her previous sexual experiences except in derogatory ways? All she learned and experienced from her previous partners is, by definition, bad and wrong. Her new husband is her only sexual partner, since she has renewed her virginity. It is an amazing mental gymnastic that only a religion or a schizophrenic could contrive. Of course, this insanity is not unique to women. I have known many Christian men who experience the male equivalent. Their sexual ideas and inhibitions are deeply rooted in religious doctrine and teachings. Catholic priests and nuns are among the best at teaching this. Those with the least experience in sex are also the ones perpetuating highly destructive ideas. The 1998 documentary, Sex in a Cold Climate, on the Irish Magdalena homes is instructive by documenting the incredibly cruel sexual messages and training of the Magdalena nuns. Here is what one woman wrote me several years ago. At 22, I married a good Catholic man and converted. I had been raised in a fairly non-religious home, but his religiosity seemed a part of the attraction at the time. It was something I had not seen or experienced before, and it held a certain attraction. We seemed to click in most areas. I liked his integrity and honesty. He had an air of confidence about him that just seemed to melt me. It was clear that from the start that he was sexually inexperienced. While I was never promiscuous, I'd been around the block a few times with a couple other boyfriends. I wasn't as uptight about sex as he was, but figured he would loosen up after we got married. We did sleep together before we got married, but it was not that great. Seemed racked with guilt about our premarital sex, so I stopped tempting him. After we got married, it went south quickly. Our first night, I decided to give him a treat and go down on him. Before we were married, he had insisted on strictly missionary position and nothing else. I figured now that we were married, what we do in the bedroom is our business. Boy, was I wrong. He nearly bit off my head when he figured out what I was getting ready to do. Little did I know I was committing a mortal sin. I had never heard any sermons that prohibited oral sex, and none of the premarital counseling we did with the priest indicated it was wrong. Well, it was wrong as far as he was concerned. Only prostitutes did that. My wife will never do that. He couldn't even say the word. That should have been my first clue. In 3 years of trying, I could never communicate with him about sex. He seemed totally uninterested in what I wanted and absolutely refused to relax and try something different once in a while. He responded to me like it was from outer space if I suggested anything. About 3.5 years into the marriage, when I was totally sick of going to church and climbing the walls in sexual frustration, I discovered he was visiting prostitutes when he was out of town. I tried talking to him about it, but there was no talking as far as he was concerned. He was definitely embarrassed and contrite, but it didn't change anything. I look back and think how stupid I was. All the signs were there. I just didn't pay attention to them.
That was me. All the signs were there. I just didn't pay attention to them. Y'all, that's part 2 of Sex and God. How religion distorted sexuality. I hope y'all enjoyed this session. We'll be back sometime tomorrow with another session. Maybe. I don't know. You like I say, it's a long book, so it depends on how I feel. I never know what's gonna pop into my brain. Cause right now I have another live that I'm finna do as soon as I end this one. Spiritual Studies 53 with my boy. So let me tell y'all what it's gonna be. I already got it scheduled. Just finished doing it. See here. This is gonna be Spiritual Studies 53 with my boy C.G. Darling, I Ching, Terrence McKenna's Time Wave, where mathematics meet mysticism, eschatology, and change. That's going to come up as soon as I end this stream. I'm coming right back with that.